My husband stole my $800,000 ATM card and left divorce papers. He thought he won, but I had the last laugh. My name is Shirley, and this is the story of my marriage, the betrayal I never saw coming, and the moment I chose freedom over staying in an emotionally draining relationship. I'm in my 50s, and for years, I thought I had the life I wanted. That is, until my husband, Scott, showed his true colors. In the end, his selfishness drove me to plan a way out of our marriage and, thankfully, save myself in the process. When I first married Scott, I thought I was entering a new, wonderful chapter. For the first 3 months, he was charming, attentive, and even thoughtful. He seemed supportive, always encouraging me in small ways. But as time went on, his behavior changed. He began revealing a more controlling side, as if he believed that a wife should always put her husband's wishes above her own. It felt old-fashioned and outdated, but I told myself I could handle it, that it was just part of marriage. As months passed, however, Scott's demands intensified. He began dictating everything in the household, from how I washed his clothes to how I cooked his meals. Nothing was ever enough for him. No matter how hard I tried, he'd always find fault. Even the smallest thing, like making breakfast a little late, would set him off. He'd lash out, calling me names, and I'd end up feeling like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. One day, I'd had enough. I collapsed while doing chores, dizzy and overwhelmed from the physical and emotional toll his demands were taking on me. Our neighbors, alarmed by the noise, called the building manager, who then called an ambulance. I woke up in a hospital bed, where doctors informed me I was severely stressed and exhausted. It felt like a slap in the face to realize I'd allowed myself to fall this far. But the shock didn't end there. After more tests, the doctor told me I had cancer. I was devastated. Alone in the hospital, I tried to process the news, feeling as if my entire world was crashing down. I needed to reach out to my family, but they were hours away by plane. My parents had passed, and my brother lived across the country. I had no one else nearby except for Scott. With a heavy heart, I sent him a message, explaining the situation and asking him to come to the hospital. But Scott, as always, seemed more inconvenienced than concerned. Hours went by without a response, and when he finally replied, his message was brief and dismissive. "I'll come tomorrow. Wait for me." It hurt, but I wasn't surprised. I'd learned not to expect much from it. The next day, Scott showed up around noon, and when he walked in, the first words out of his mouth were, "You look healthier than I thought. I expected you to be more frail." His coldness was like a punch to the gut. I tried to stay calm, asking if he had brought the change of clothes I'd requested, but he just shrugged. "I had another errand," he said. I couldn't believe it. Here I was newly diagnosed with cancer, and his main priority was some other errand. I felt a wave of sadness, realizing that the man I'd married would never be there for me when it really counted. But then, he revealed why he'd actually come to see me. With a casual smile, he asked, "So, where's the ATM card?" The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Scott wasn't here out of concern for my health. He was here for my money. At that moment, I knew I needed to be careful. I had saved $800,000 through careful investments in the stock market, a fund I'd built quietly over the years. I didn't trust Scott with this money, but I decided to test his intentions. "There's $800,000 in that account," I told him. "Handle it carefully." His eyes widened, and I could almost see the greed shining through his face. "Thanks," he said, pocketing the card without hesitation. I let him take it, knowing it would be the last time he'd ever think he could manipulate me. I had a plan, and Scott had just fallen right into it. The next morning, I requested a short discharge from the hospital, telling the doctors I needed to collect a few things from home. They allowed it, and I made my way back to our shared apartment. I was only there a few minutes when I noticed something on the table, a set of divorce papers. Along with them was a hastily written note from Scott. "Let's get divorced. Sign these and submit them." Seeing those papers, I felt a strange sense of relief. Scott had taken the ATM card and assumed he'd be able to access my money and move on. What he didn't realize was that I'd already set things in motion. I went to the bank that morning and reported the card as stolen. By the time Scott tried to withdraw anything, the account would be locked, and he'd be left empty-handed. I signed the divorce papers, packed up a few essentials, and returned to the hospital, ready to start my life over. While I was resting in my hospital bed, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Scott had been trying to withdraw money and was realizing that something was wrong. His messages started out calm, but quickly grew more desperate. I can't access the money. Tell me what to do. Finally, he called. The card isn't working, he said, his voice frantic. What happened? I took a deep breath, holding back a smile. The card you took has been reported as stolen, I replied. It's useless now. There was a long pause. Why would you do that? He finally asked, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. Because I know what you've been planning, Scott, I said, my tone cold. I'm done being manipulated. He pleaded, his desperation mounting. Please, Shirley, you're the only person I can turn to. I need that money. I let out a sigh, almost feeling a bit of pity, but not quite.
No, Scott.
You need to figure this out on your own. He kept calling, leaving messages, each one more desperate than the last. But I knew I'd made the right decision. I blocked his number and turned my focus back to my recovery. When I was finally discharged from the hospital, I felt like a new person. I was free from Scott, free from the emotional weight he'd put on me, and ready to start fresh. I moved out of our apartment, found a peaceful new place to live, and began focusing on my health and happiness. A few months later, a mutual friend told me that Scott had spiraled after losing access to my money. He'd quit his job, run up debts, and was now struggling to make ends meet. In the end, he'd lost everything he'd thought he could take from me. As for me, I'd gained something priceless: peace, independence, and a new beginning. I knew now that I'd never again settle for less than I deserved. And in my quiet, peaceful life, I found happiness that no amount of money could buy.